Hi, I'm Paul Spears. I am the director of the Torrey Honors Institute here at Biola University, and we are excited today to have a conversation with these distinguished guests about C.S. Lewis, the Inklings, and their effect on our Christian lives. I'd like to take a moment and introduce all of these panelists, if you call them that. To my right will be Dave Horner, who has a D.Phil from Oxford and Thomas Aquinas. He has recently written a book called Mind Your Faith, A Student's Guide to Thinking Well and Living Well. We're excited to have him here. And well, James Houston is to his left, my right. And he also has a D.Phil from Oxford. You will quickly notice there'll be a pattern here. In cultural and historical geography, I would love to even just talk about that. He is a founding father of Regent College, and I think really the reason that Dr. Hindmarsh has his job in some abstract way. He has been really important in the area of Christian classics, historical theology, and really in the tradition of Christian spirituality. To my left is Chris Mitchell, who has a PhD in theology from St. Andrews, and he's focusing on the work of Jonathan Edwards, and he was a former director of the Marion Wade Center at Wheaton College, which has housing all of the or many of the works of C.S. Lewis and of the Inklings. We're excited to have him here. And then to his left is Bruce Hindmarsh, who is the James M. Houston Professor of Spiritual Theology, named after this person. Right to my right, he has written and spoken extensively on the history of early British evangelism, and is currently working on early evangelical spirituality. So we're excited to have him here. So today what I'd like to do is just start and have a conversation about Christian intellectual history in the 20th century and what role Lewis played in sort of the reemergence, you might want to call it that, of a Christian intellectual life. How do you think he changed that? What role did he play? How did he influence that in terms of his writings, his speakings? What role did that have for us as evangelicals? So many of us know of him. And how did that develop us?
One of the roles that Lewis played is he talked about himself as a translator. And I think the capacity for a whole generation who no longer had the kind of classical inheritance or had the deeper sense of Western history, of that medieval history and so on, that he had a kind of Robin Hood ministry of taking from the rich and giving to the poor, of kind of passing on, and became a path down which people could walk back to the classics. And you read Lewis, and then you wanted to read Dante. You read Lewis, and then you wanted to read Milton.
So he was a gateway.
I think so. I think it's for a lot of people. Yeah, I know he was for me. Yeah,
I think that concept of translation is the critical point, because what he did was he invited people into the space called Milton, the space called Dante, and translated it so that they could enter into the conversation. It moved from sort of academic jargon down to everyday sort of language, giving entree to people and drawing them into these areas. And he did that as well as anybody.
Okay.
I think what I would say is that Lewis was a man of his times, but the man of the times that he was living in was very extraordinary times. It was the war that really broke all the restraints of social perspectives on life that hadn't existed before. So when he really was given a voice to be able to speak as a Christian, he was saying he was doing his war work. And so when you were doing war work, as I was doing in Edinburgh at the time of the war, I was doing work on the roof of our university, just removing incendiary bombs. And James Barr and James Torrance were two of my rollicking friends at that time, doing our war work on the roof of the university. Well, Lewis, by visiting the airfields and giving man-to-man talks, because one of his alumni, Canon Babington, had twisted his arm to go to the airfields, he then began to speak, not as a theologian, not as ordained Anglican priest, but as a layman doing war work. And it was the generation, of course, that Dr. Lloyd Jones, who had been a Harley Street up-and-coming physician, the assistant to the King's physician. He started his war work by commuting every Sunday to do pulpit supply in Wales. So that broke all the paradigms of the time. And that gave Lewis a voice on the radio that was also a voice that was used later by Malcolm Muggeridge in television, but it was a voice that was used by Lord Bullock, who was one of my colleagues, and various other people. So the breaking of the old traditional boundaries of etiquette was the way in which Lewis was able to speak as a Christian polemicist. And of course the opportunity was also enlarged by the fact that we felt we were very much in a righteous war against evil, that we saw this not as a repeat of the First World War, but that this was a war against a horrible, evil force of Nazism. So then everybody was on a kind of religious crusade. It might be interpreted much more secularly, but that was the environment in which really Lewis was catapulted. And I don't think if he hadn't had his arm twisted by the BBC to do these talks, as well as his own motivation to be involved in the bombing of London, in the sense that he writes The Problem of Pain in that context, that got the attention of the BBC, and then the broadcast talks that he did.
Which become Mere Christianity, right? As
Yes.
we know them, yeah.
I don't think we would have known Lewis as we know him today.
So in some sense, these beginning moments, he was sort of thrust into the limelight in ways he might not have planned on.
Oh, he didn't want to be the limelight. No. And so many, many times he said no, no, no to all the appeals of the religious director of the BBC. So twisting his arm for these 3 occasions was enough for him, and when all the other times he was begged to go and repeat. So one area of research that perhaps has not yet been fully done is the archives of the BBC. So the Clyde Kilby Trust has to try and somehow twist the arm of the BBC to add to the collection.
The difficulty there is that there's nothing there. It's been mined. They don't know where it is.
Can't find it.
Unfortunately, yes.
Well, I think recently there was one of his talks that was published.
Right,
So they did
for the
find
most
a stray
part, yeah,
document.
for the most part, it's not there. Even the first original recording of Dorothy Sayers' "The Man Born to Be King" is not there as well. No one knows what happened to them. But Dorothy Sayers would be another one who came alongside and was involved in war work, and she actually has an essay called "War Work," and then her book "Begin Here." It was all about taking the opportunity that the war provided to step in and to bring the Christian message down to the people through radio. And I remember James Welch, in his invitation to Lewis in his letter, said at that time that you're looking at probably about 1 million people in your audience.
Wow. It's interesting because one of the things that I would wonder is Lewis's experience in World War I with sort of the unwashed masses that were troops in his platoon or battalion. He got to meet everybody, right? And I wonder how much the war experience, even in World War I, flattened out his understanding of human beings and sort of gave him a desire to even have conversations that were, not as rigorous in a certain sense as he would have had with his colleagues at, let's say, Oxford.
Well, certainly the First World War had a strong effect on John McMurray, because when he came out of that disenchanted with the denominations supporting the war, that's when he started becoming a pacifist. And it changed his whole attitude both to Christianity. He had come from a very strong evangelical faith among the Plymouth Brethren. And he reacted against all of that because he saw far too much of the church being involved in a nasty thing like the First World War. But that didn't seem to affect Lewis in the same way at all.
I'd also say that I don't know if it was the catalyst that sort of flattened things because of his early relationship with Arthur Greaves. I think what it did was deepen and enhance what the common person afforded. And I think that's a big theme of Chesterton's. And Lewis knew Chesterton quite well. But what it may have done is knowing what happened in the First World War, knowing there's a similar audience during the Second World War, because he was very sensitive to audience, Lewis was, and was a genius in terms of being able to speak to different audiences. I mean, you see that from his letters to children, within fictional literature, children, as well as his adult science fiction, but also academic. But it seems clear from his response to James Welch that he was very much aware of the audience that he was going to be speaking to across Britain through the radio
I think
broadcast.
that's very true. And I think of one occasion when I was speaking to Lewis, I said, isn't it rather remarkable that you got some medical students attending your public lectures that you're giving for the whole university on the meaning of words? Oh, he said, that is my claim to fame, that medical students attend my lectures, because the whole nature of lectures in Oxford was that if you weren't interested, especially we had a historian on the Napoleonic Wars, and I think he had an audience of 5 with his wife knitting in the foreground, but it wasn't compulsory to attend lectures. Right. So if people drew people to their lectures, then that really was a plum. So I remember Lewis being quite proud of the fact that the medicals were attending the university schools to his lectures on plain meaning of words.
If I could, David, I'd be interested to know how you view Lewis's influence on the philosophical sort of scene.
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking earlier today about this. Excuse me. I have a friend who is a sort of a village atheist philosopher, and it irks him that so many Christians, American Christian people, love Lewis. And so one of my favorite memories is when a major philosopher, Norman Kretzmann, who had multiple articles in the early Encyclopedia of Philosophy back in the early 60s, came to Christ later in life. Nobody would doubt his philosophical credentials. I mean, he was bigger than big. And so my village atheist friend asked him about Lewis, and he said, "Oh, I think he's very good." He looked. I would say that in general, people would think that he doesn't have the analytic feel that is popular today among many of us. He's not logic crunching. He's of the old, more classical type.
Well, he's reacting against logical positivism. So that was a strong reaction he had.
But he was also, I read a letter that he wrote to someone who was charging him with just rehashing Aquinas in his ethics. And he said, well, Aquinas and I went to the same school. We both learned from Aristotle. Right. Yeah. So if you just look at the references to Aristotle and Plato and his writings, they're very significant. And so he has this pre-modern, more classical approach. No doubt was influenced in his Greats education at Oxford. Yes, it was the
Greats education that did it.
And the way what I understand is in his debate with Elizabeth Anscombe, one of the factors there was that she really represented this new sort of hyper-analytic Wittgenstein sort of approach, and he had been investing his time in other places, and he really didn't feel up to trying to go down that path. But all that being said, he thinks well, he makes good distinctions, he's clearly very literate in philosophy, and actually, in terms of my baptism in Lewis, I'm much, I've gone down his road much more, down the greats road, and really appreciating the classical approach to ethics and other things, and Lewis was the reason that I kind of got captured by that.
Well, that's interesting, because I think in our culture, we tend to think that you have to be so narrowly defined to be a really good academic. And I think Lewis, for us, breaks that mold. I mean, he's certainly got skills in his disciplines, medieval and Renaissance literature, right? He knows exactly what he's doing in there, but he's able to step outside of that. And I think in a way that is attractive to most of us who don't think of our lives as these narrowly refined. As a matter of fact, most people that even do really narrowly refined analytic philosophy have to do normal things like buy groceries, think about their lives.
Some of them
take
do.
care of, take care of their kids, right? I mean, those are the kind of things that are normal life issues that aren't addressed in a narrowly defined discipline. And I wonder even how Lewis sort of reopened some of those opportunities for us as thinkers.
Well, I think of what Harry Blamires once said, is that what Lewis did was broke academic protocol by working not only within his specialty, but moving beyond that. And that was a sort of thing not done, as they say, across the pond.
Mm-hmm. Even bringing together medieval and Renaissance literature in his work, too. It's part of that, I think. Yeah.
Well, as I was saying last night, that one of the things about breaking etiquette in the high table was you don't speak about religion any more than you speak about your kidneys. They're both concealed members of your anatomy. And that's the offense of Lewis, that he was so, and of course it was an offense even against, with Tolkien, because Tolkien never expressed his communication of faith, not even to his children.
Wow. Yeah, there's much more of an embodied sense of what his Christianity means, isn't there? I mean, he's really wrestling with what it means to him and then trying to understand it in light of his intellectual skills. I'd be really interested when we think about how he brings this notion of orderliness. I mean, so you said Milton and Dante earlier, and so I would argue that that's some sort of, theological cosmology he's doing. How do you think his thoughts about sort of medieval Renaissance literature sort of smash into sort of an evangelical, if you want to call him that, I don't know what you want to call him, perspective on orderliness and how we should be thinking as humans and as Christians?
Let's come back to that in a minute. I just want to go back to the point about the narrow profession, like the narrowness that Lewis breaks those boundaries. It strikes me that one of the things that he does, I just was thinking about this when you were speaking, is he maintains a very consistent voice across his writings, right? It's not like there's one kind of voice in his letters and an entirely different kind of voice like you're reading somebody else when he writes his Oxford History of English Literature. There's a very consistent voice that is, I think that's part of what's very appealing, is you feel like he's very centered and doesn't become a different person as he enters different discourses.
You know, I wish I had it memorized. I should by this time. It's a statement by Owen Barfield about Lewis, that basically he says that everything Lewis thought about one thing contained everything he thought about everything else. I mean, he was a thoroughly integrated sort of person, and I think that's getting at what you're saying. So you get sort of all of Lewis in anything that he's doing.
That's why I would even ask his notions of orderliness. I think they all pour into and out of himself. So he's thinking about the way in which God has created the universe, and then he thinks, well, that's just kind of structures everything that I think. And I think that he's really working hard to sort of think in terms of that integrated notion. So I wonder if you guys have any thoughts about my previous question about how does he bring these notions together of orderliness, and how does that maybe even cause him more intentionally to cross?
I wonder if that was part of his sort of medieval background too. I remember in the discarded image he said, the one modern invention that medieval man would have most appreciated is the Rolodex, you know? And a very dated reference now, but the sense of everything had its place and in a well-ordered universe. And he was so steeped in that kind of medieval, the just ordering of the affections, the just ordering of the world, having an ordinate response to the world as it is, and so on. I would venture to say that
the one piece that did that for Lewis, ordered everything, was the incarnation. I see that because when he writes back to Arthur Greaves about what happened during that late night talk with Dyson and Tolkien, was they helped him unpack the meaning of the incarnation, of the life, death, and of Jesus Christ and resurrection. In Miracles, in Surprised by Joy, in the narrative of his spiritual journey, it's that. When that comes together, then it begins to draw everything into it. And in many ways, he plays that out in his fiction in Aslan. Once he says Aslan came into the story, it brought everything together. In Paralandra, he says when God became man, the universe turned a corner, and nothing's been the same since. So I think it doesn't answer all of the question, but I would say that was the one missing piece. And once that came together, it began to order everything else.
I wasn't hoping that just you would answer that question,
No.
and pull it all together for us. So I was hoping.
no.
I know.
I know.
was just teasing.
Yeah.
That's the true
But that's
myth.
a good place to begin.
yeah.
Yes.
It's the true myth,
Yes.
which puts everything in perspective.
So can you say a little more about that for us?
No,
Okay.
he said it. But, Lewis talks a lot about myth and his view that myth, and you guys being literary people are, much better at this than I am, but my understanding is that there is, that in the fairy tales and so on are kind of echoes and hints of a deeper true story, and there's the story of death and rebirth and so on. But when Jesus comes, he, in one sense, it's the myth, but this is actually the true myth.
This become history.
This is history. And so it makes sense of lots of things. It makes sense of the cosmos, kind of as we were talking about, but also makes sense of history and all these yearnings that we have and these longings and these intimations of the deep structure of reality. It actually becomes history.
Yes. Yeah. But I think also for Lewis and Tolkien, their involvement in myth is the context of their child loneliness, of the ruminations that they had in solitude. And that world was, in a sense, much more inhabited than the adult world around them. Because after Lewis, his mother, died, he said, I was as if I was on the continent of Atlantis, and it had slipped under the waves, and all that was left was a small rocky islet in a heaving ocean. Well, out of that kind of imaginary life that he felt within himself, then I think he was fascinated at a more scholarly level later about mythology, just as Tolkien was. And in some ways, the tension between them was that Tolkien thought that the mythopoeic world of Lewis had been, in a sense, cribbing on Charles Williams. It was it was bringing it down to, Charing Cross and what's happening in the street and on the bus to hell. Whereas the world that was mythopoeic about Tolkien was entirely his own. And I think it was entirely his own because a Catholic in that culture did not articulate faith. And he certainly was a very shy child and didn't have a good early family background. And the very fact that he never even communicated to his children about his faith suggests that this inner interiority of living was very different from how he lived socially outside. And so, while we benefited from that mythopoeic imagination to give us depth in our sort of shallowness of a technocratic society, he is certainly just water from the oasis for the dryness of our situation today. But I think what we often find in the Christian life is that our ministry comes most from our wounds and from our abilities. And perhaps you might interpret that imaginative life that they both lived was expressive of long childhood wounds.
And so you could even say that it's expressed in our longings.
It's what?
Our longings, the
Of
things
course.
that we deeply desire.
course.
And then you read someone
the
like Tolkien or Lewis,
Yes.
and it draws you. I remember reading and
Yes.
thinking, why does this person know me?
Because I think what happens is
Like Augustine.
that we all have
Yes.
this mirage that what is most intimately me, you will never understand.
Yeah.
Whereas what we discover is what is most intimately me is humanly universal.
Yeah.
And
Lewis probably
so-
captures that as well as
Yes.
anything in the Weight of Glory sermon.
He does, yes.
Whether you grasp it all, you go away having experienced something that is authentic and real. You've been drawn into something.
Yes.
I think part of what the force for me of like the Weight of Glory, the sermon on transposition, and the mythopoeic imagination of these writers that we're talking about is, and I wonder if this is part of the impact more generally, if my experience is shared by others, but is that Lewis was able, for me, like these other writers, to unite the good and the beautiful. So that the typical sort of sermon at church is, what do we call it, deontological. You just have, here are the beliefs that are to be believed, and here's your duties and moral obligations as a result. So believe this and behave this way. But what didn't unite them was anything that either moved the affections or grasped your imagination. And to realize that the good is the unspeakably beautiful. I feel like you see that time and again in these writers.
Amen.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what Tolkien actually did for me as an unbelieving chap in Oregon, is that I'd never been
I think
in
you
a
said
church.
hippie last time I talked.
Well, I was too young for a hippie at this point. I was actually going into my freshman year in high school and read The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And I underwent some sort of baptism. Lewis uses that with MacDonald. But it was in the good. In Tolkien, I came up against a goodness that I'd never experienced. And while I knew the story was fiction, I had this deep sense that Tolkien saw this as real.
The high moral quest.
Yeah, and it was beautiful and terrifying, and I wanted it, but I didn't know where to get it. And I think, in a sense, to use MacDonald's term, Tolkien awoke something inside of me that set me on this journey.
When my wife was young and somebody gave her the Chronicles of Narnia, not knowing any kind of Christian connection, she was an unbeliever, but when she finished the last battle, she cried because she wished it were true. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One other thing about the loneliness of these men was also their academic loneliness. Because Tolkien had come from Leeds, and so he was from the provinces, and so you're never quite on the same status if you're not an Oxford man. And he wasn't an Oxford man. He came from outside, very much like Hugo Dyson that I know personally as well. And he was from the outside. So these outsiders were always treated rather differently from those who had been bred and trained in Oxford. So that was one thing. But Tolkien was an Anglo-Saxon, which was compulsory in the English school. And even he knew in his generation that if Anglo-Saxon hadn't been compulsory for the English on a school, there wouldn't have been any employment for the Anglo-Saxon teachers. and so within English, he was isolated by the fact that he was more interested in Beowulf than somebody in the 17th or 18th century. And Lewis, of course, his isolation really did arise from his religious articulation.
Is part of what you're saying, Jim, that there's a correlation between loneliness, alienation, and longing?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm interested too. So we're all articulating this as soon as we started talking about longing. We all go, oh yeah. And I wonder how. So all of us as academics, if that might be an interesting psychological discussion we could table for later. But it's also interesting how I think as we come into contact with some of these things that are real, how it doesn't just draw us into ourselves, but it actually causes us to look outside of ourselves. And I wonder how that draws us into a notion of community and even Christian community. So we start to look around for ways in which that resonance can be fulfilled in a deeper way. And I wonder how that might be some of that might be a driving factor for all of us.
Yeah, it's a way to get into this. Tolkien, in his essay on fairy stories, actually says that one of the things that fairy story does well when it's done well is to get us outside of ourselves. So there's an intentionality. What you're saying is pointing to the fact that these writers do this because there is an intentionality. That's one of the things they're trying to do. MacDonald says the same thing. How they do it, that's another question.
Well, I think these abstractions are illustrated by the children's game of hide and seek. Because when our grandchildren used to hide, and one of them whispered to me, "Grandpa, I'm here in the foliage of this tree." I said, "Stephen, you know, you're playing hide and seek." "Oh, Grandpa, it's no fun playing hide and seek if you're not found." And so the whole purpose of the child
really
playing
good.
hide and seek is to be recognized, is to be identified.
Nothing worse than being everyone else going in
That's
and you're
right.
still hiding and no one finds
And so
you,
this
right?
idea that out of that inner loneliness, there is such a passion for communication externally is, I think, part of that very childish, primitive instinct that we have, that as a social being, I want to be unique, but I want to be the same as everybody else.
Well, he says, you're saying then, Jim, that Lewis and Tolkien knew this, deeply understood this, and knew that that was true of every human heart. And so they knew they had an
I don't think
audience.
they philosophized on that level. I think that they suffered at that level. I think we're making them more self-conscious than perhaps they were.
I'm referring to A Weight of Glory. It seems to me there
Yes.
that Lewis is very much aware of that longing to hear a responsive
Well
voice.
done.
You know,
Yeah.
coming
Yes.
back, and that
Oh, yes.
because he knew that, they knew they had an audience.
Oh, yes.
So they just had to, in a sense, create the space
Yes,
and allow them to come into it.
yes,
And then the story would do the work.
yes.
Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Where he talks about being an ingredient in the divine
Happiness.
and the joy of the child and being recognized by the father. It's pretty profound.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so maybe one of the things that we're even talking about is how this is, it sort of revivifies or it re-engages us in this bigger question about what does it really mean to ultimately be human. I remember him talking or writing in Surprised by Joy, when, isn't it Arthur Greaves? I'm always forgetting who it is, where he meets him and he says, "I didn't know someone liked the same things I like."
Yes,
I
it
thought
was
there was
Greaves,
no one,
yeah.
I thought it was.
Well, and Tolkien, he says the same thing about Tolkien in terms of connection in this mythic area, right?
And so I think that again, I was talking earlier about flattening things out. I think that in the best sense, that's what this does. It actually causes resonance between peoples, and then we start to say, "Oh, I've got the same real needs."
That's the way Lewis talked about friendship and the four loves. His
Yeah,
friendship
exactly
is
right.
formed shoulder to shoulder, not face to face. It's that you're looking at
Doing
the
the same
same
thing.
thing and say, "Oh, you like that too."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
So
too.
really,
right.
this is the communication skill that they both give, is that they don't communicate flatly, they communicate subliminally. And so there's a level at which we say, aha, that is very much deeper than being informed.
How do you think that translates to our notions of Christian community? What role do you think that Lewis played in terms of maybe making us more aware of our need for that?
I think one of the importance of friendship. We're just talking about friendship, and there maybe is a relationship between both the alienation and the desire for friendship and writing about friendship. But I think of the friendships that we're talking about, and even the literary friendships, the Inklings, is I think that sense of gathering together in the spirit of friendship around great enterprises, around great discussions, but that sense of collegiality of friendship, I think that's the hidden history of great things that happen, you know, and that we're so used to programmatic activity in our culture where we plan things, we have single purposes, we seek to be resourceful and to achieve them, evaluate and repeat, you know, whereas that kind of community, that kind of a group of friends gathered together in a disinterested way is fruitful in multiple ways. It becomes seed time and harvest rather than just rational activity.
If I didn't know better, it sounds like you were arguing for space in our culture and time, which we don't give it very often.
Well, of
just the
course we
fact-
have. Sorry,
Sorry.
you carry on.
Just the fact that these guys got together regularly,
Right.
Yeah.
you know, the Inklings and his buddies on Thursday nights, and what came out of those things. But they just made space to hang out,
That's
and
right.
talk.
And you had groups like that at Oxford that
Yes,
met in your
the
home?
group that we had at Nicholas Zernoff's home, bringing in Lewis and the friends you mentioned, and Hugo Dyson was the soul of the party. He was far more, in some ways, he was just as dynamic a speaker. He could outspeak Lewis, which was saying something. So yes, the stimulus of those kind of groups was wonderful. But you know, this is human. It's not just a historical event. It's what we see in the Clapham sect. It's what we see in the circle round Josiah Wedgwood, you know. This is natural.
But
We think of it as an aberration, but somehow
yeah.
Right.
shows how wacky
Is
our
there a
culture's become.
Is there a sense, though, that what the Inklings did was sort of gave permission to a community of scholars to do that very thing? Rather than this ivory tower, there's a sense in which much of Oxford, from what Professor Packhurst told me, is this ivory tower thing. And while you had these groups, the Inklings wasn't the only one, they weren't the norm. There was something of an anomaly. Is that correct?
Well, the Oxford environment, when I was growing up in the 40s, well, the 50s and 60s and 70s, was still a very artificial environment. It had been intruded on by returning soldiers who were often officers in a much more senior position than their tutors. So that was a rather anomaly in the late 40s. But it still remained an artificial environment. I mean, even when I was saying last night that when I told my colleagues at Brasenose, where I was a lecturer at the time, that I was getting engaged, there was no congratulations. Oh, Houston, we thought better of your scholarship than to get engaged. So this kind of monastic environment was still lingering, you see. And it was a curio of an old lady walking down the streets that was pointed out to us. Do you realize that she was the first child to be born to an Oxford Don who was allowed to hold his position? Wow, that was tremendous, that event. So that was the part of that world. Socially, it was artificial. It was monastic. But also, of course, the snobbery of it. And there was snobbery within the dynamics of the senior common room. Like, as I say, there was a snobbery about really who was Hugo Dyson and who was Tolkien, because they were not one of us. There was the snobbery that developed in the 50s and 60s about, do you really need a DPhil? You know, aren't you good enough? Well, obviously you're second class if you need a DPhil. Well, that's not the American mentality.
Yeah.
And so for intruders like Clyde Kilby, who wrote to me and said, will you make me an introduction for Lewis to arrange for lunch together? It was like a breath across the Atlantic of fresh air when, I don't need to be introduced. I've introduced myself, you see. I used to walk down the street and commute with a fellow of Baliol. We crossed the street at the same juncture for 16 years. We'd never been introduced. And so we never looked at each other. We looked at the sky, we looked at the mud on the pavement, but never into our eyes. And then in 1972, I see him across the street in Vancouver, and I rushed across and I said, isn't it ridiculous? We've never said hello. And so he came for dinner that night. But that's what the transatlantic crossing does culturally. So that was the kind of world, you see.
So there is a sense in which this model, I guess what I'm saying is this model of Inklings sort of broke again protocol and etiquette, and especially because there were students, past students involved, like George Sayer. You know, so this idea of hierarchy, everybody was the same within this group, and it seems to me that model.
But they did it accidentally. It was no deliberate policy. It was happenstance. You see.
But I think that's part of the idea. It was random, unstructured. It just happened.
But I wonder if it might be, while it was accidental, they didn't intentionally try to, fight against the man, whatever that would have been exactly at Oxford. It does seem that that's driven out of a sense of themselves, that seemed like a natural response to who they were and were becoming, rather than them staying inside of a set of cultural expectations where they thought, no, of course we can invite other people.
Of course, if you're a Christian, you want to be a human being.
Right.
Probably other people don't want to.
So is that saying that those people weren't always human that were university dons? And
Exactly. Their role and protocol and all of that made them very artificial sometimes. But, and this is why you get sometimes terrible loneliness. For example, our friend, philosopher Foster, Michael Foster.
Yeah.
I invited him for dinner one Thursday night at Brasenose, and he was trying to articulate, because he stuttered a bit in his own loneliness, and I never heard his cry at the dinner table. And a week later, he had gassed himself.
Wow.
So you realize the poignancy that it's possible not to be very human in that kind of environment. You see?
One of the things that strikes me that has always attracted me to Lewis is just how human he is.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
that's, you talked about your wife wishing it were true. I like to think of it as it's too good not to be true. Yeah. And that's the kind of vision that Lewis tends to give. Yeah. And it's very human. And it isn't compartmentalized in the different disciplines. Yeah. And there's laughter, there's humor, there's beauty, there's joy. I think
Rest.
I was, yes, I think I was, and still am, just drawn to the humanness of it, which really is this pre-modern kind of way of looking at things, which is very much, part feet on the ground, but a rich, thick way of living.
To come back to the potential influence on community and the church, as alluded to, I was this long-hair hippie, and Tolkien was huge in the late 60s and early 70s, and what it spawned was Hobbit-like behavior. this sort of gathering around common things. Tolkien had a way of, like Chesterton before him, re-enchanting the ordinary. And so instead of these grandiose kinds of things, it was the bread on the table, the trees outside, walks, good food, good drink. And I remember coming to faith at 21 and moving into the church, that many of my so-called ilk who came out of that into the church brought that with them. Brought a sort of social dynamic that was not at home at that time within the church. They didn't know what to do with us because we came in terribly excited about every little thing, in a sense, and actually helping them come out of the more staid kind of way of looking at things, and this notion of hospitality, in a democratic sort of way. I think, at least my observation is I would actually attribute some of that to Tolkien.
A little bit of Hobbiton at church. Exactly,
yeah. Because it touched, as we were talking about earlier on, this deepest longing for connectedness, and we just didn't know how to do it. But Tolkien gave us a way. You just do it over common things, as the Inklings did. They just get together in shabby room, it sounds like to me, but over fellowship. Yeah.
There's also this sense, and you were maybe pushing us this direction, Paul, but a sense of being connected also to the world. And I'm thinking about that there is an ordered, objective response to the world, and that's the way the discarded image ends, with a kind of lament for this medieval worldview that in some forms of behaviorism, the subject even now eats up itself, and that we were talking last night, Jim. What was the book that Lewis said when you talked to him he felt was his most important?
Oh, yes. I asked him towards the end of my time with him, what was the most important message that he had sought to articulate in all his works. Oh, he says, it's all contained in my 3 lectures, riddle lectures on the abolition of man. And then he said, and what should be included also as the most important novel I've ever written is Till We Have Faces. And it disappointed him very greatly that 1,000 copies was all that the publisher would let him have issued for the edition, and they never were sold. So people never recognized the importance of those 2 things in his lifetime.
Because it's the abolition of man that most clearly makes that statement about a response to an ordered response to the world, right? That without that you become men without chests.
Well, it was really a critique of 2 young Australian literary critics who had written very naive...
I would really not want to have been them, right?
Who had written a popular sort of textbook for children on literary criticism that was, for him, scientistic and totally reductionistic. And so he was so angered that this was poisoning the mind of a child. And so, although he was kindly in refraining from giving them their true names, he gives them nom de plumes in his book. But that stirred him up. But of course, behind all that was the whole issue of logical positivism. That was to him philosophically a huge reductionism.
I'd be interested, Bruce, to better understand what you're saying in terms of the subjective way of ordering. How does it play itself out? What does it look like in terms of me moving towards the world with this?
If I understand the argument that Lewis makes, he begins with this book in which the authors talk about when you say that when Wordsworth says this waterfall is sublime, what you're really saying is that you have sublime feelings. And he says, first of all, just phenomenologically, you got it dead wrong. Right. You don't have sublime feelings, you have humble feelings before that's the vast. But that the source of these feelings is not just my own enlarged subjectivity. The source is it is a response to the objective world in the presence of the vast and the great and the infinite. There's a just response.
Okay.
So
or even right.
Yeah. What's that?
Just to say it's pretty is not sufficient nor right, really.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so that when we want things like patriotism in people, he says, you've hollowed out the connection between the instinct and the head. You no longer can have a just and ordered affection. So there's a sense that there are just and ordered affections. There is a rich subjective life, but it's been hollowed out by this kind of subject-object dichotomy.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And now I understand where you're coming.
And of course, what Lewis didn't himself say, but was very much his principle for all his thinking, was that the innate logic of an object studied determines how it should be studied. And so there's appropriateness of knowing or appropriateness of communicating. And so he recognized that shallow statements like 2 and 2 make 4 is okay to have as a mathematical statement. But deep truths, and the deeper the truth, the more diversity of genres you need for the communication of that truth.
And that even goes back to Aristotle and Aquinas, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that there are philosophers who are doing some similar things today, discovering some similar things. In fact, at the beginning of The Weight of Glory, when he talks about the right kinds of rewards, there are mercenary rewards that are just sort of tacked onto what you do. So if you try to woo a woman in order to get her money, that's an illegitimate mercenary reward for the activity you're doing. But if you're...
It's inappropriate for that.
Yes, but if you're fighting a battle in order to win, that's also a reward, but that's the proper one. It's essentially connected to it.
Right.
Yeah.
It's good.
Well, one of the really prominent philosophers today, Alistair McIntyre, makes almost the identical distinction in After Virtue under different terms, and laments that so many of our practices today are for the sake of these goods that are not internal to practices in his terminology. So we practice medicine in order to get a BMW.
Right.
Rather
Not
than
to heal people.
Yeah, rather than to
Boy.
be excellent and see people healed and do these things. So we should have a kind of teleological approach to these things, but the right sort of one. And similarly, related to what you're saying, there are many philosophers who are now talking about having the right sort of concepts, ethical concepts that they call thick ethical concepts, which are just what you were saying. So it's sublime is a thick concept. Pretty is a thin concept.
Right.
You say, oh yeah, the waterfall's pretty. Well, it's not dead wrong, and like if you said it was ugly, but it just doesn't capture what is actually true. And so the ability to actually perceive
With the richness?
with the richness, which engages your sentiments, your affections, and all that. And what Lewis was up to in that first lecture in The Abolition of Man, talking about that stuff, is right at the heart of so many debates today.
Yes, that's right.
And
it'd be very interesting for somebody to compare the journeys of Lewis and Alistair McIntyre, because they were both philosophers at University College.
Well, Basil Mitchell actually has talked
done
about
that.
this a little bit, yeah.
Because I knew, of course, Alistair McIntyre tangentially as an atheist, and I was being charged on by the InterVarsity to debate with him about 1964, and I thought, no, he's not in my category at this stage for a debate. But then I watched his journey and how he then moved from Oxford to do chair of sociology, of all things, at the University of Essex, before he then came over to America. So his pilgrim's journey has been, in a sense, it was totally apart from Lewis, but it's come so close to Lewis. But I wonder whether he's ever read Lewis.
Oh, he
He
has.
He quotes
has.
Lewis.
Yes.
Now quotes now.
Oh, yeah.
He does.
Well, even in After Virtue, he talks about Lewis a little bit.
He does, yes.
And that's when he was still an atheist.
Right.
And shortly after he released that book, he
So
became a
perhaps
Christian
there was an
again.
influence there.
Oh yeah, I'm sure there was.
Interesting.
Yeah, I want to
Interesting.
bring this conversation to Tolkien, because I understand now. Again, his project is, restoring objective value in things in and of themselves. And the literary art of these individuals, Tolkien and Lewis, and really they learned it in many ways at the feet of MacDonald, though Tolkien later says, early yes, later he denies it. But for example, this recovering, and that's one of the things that Tolkien says literarily his art is supposed to do, recover true things, so that you go into Middle-earth. And maybe you have never really thought about a tree, except for it's the sort of thing you cut down and build houses with and stoke fires with. But you come out of Middle-earth and you have recovered something about trees. Nobody comes out of Middle-earth as a tree despiser or just a utilitarian view of trees. You've recovered the objective thing that it is. And people stop and they go, yeah, beeches do sort of have, and willows are, and oaks are, you see, that they have this uncanny ability. And that's what Tolkien says, if you come out of...
The re-enchantment.
Yes, and that's Chesterton. If you come out of this world a world despiser, then something terrible has gone on here. But if you come out with new eyes to embrace the real world, then indeed you've done the work.
And I think that gets us to the question of all of these things are pointing at what? A need for a holistic understanding of what it means to be human. What is our ultimate purpose? There are intermediate goods all over the place that we do that we eat. That's enjoyable. Those things bring us pleasure. Even examining a waterfall in and of itself is a wonderful thing to do. You go to Yosemite, you can experience that at multiple levels. But ultimately, all of those things are incomplete. And I think that both Tolkien and Lewis push us, and Chesterton and MacDonald, to something more. And I think that even when we have learned to identify those things in a richer sense, we still know those aren't complete. And I think that's where the story of Christ fits in for us.
Well, you know, the person who has pursued this was Bishop Stephen Neal, who was Bishop of the Methodist Church in South India. And he wrote, after his nervous breakdown, a book towards a more genuine human existence. And so you might say that the first significant step forward in being more genuinely human is being broken. Because as a bishop, he slapped a native servant, and that was a no-no even in colonial India. And for a bishop to do that was worse. So he was forced to resign, and his career was shattered, and he had to start life all over again. And so this is perhaps, you might say Lewis and Tolkien were moving towards being more human from the angst, the longings of the pains of childhood. But others have a more dramatic pursuit of being human, and that is by being totally shattered and broken.
Thank you. I so admired Stephen Neal, but never knew that. And that's just kind of a little piece. Thanks.
And it does seem that one of the things that is necessary in our condition is an awareness of where we really are, and then an excitement about the joy and blessing that God brings us to raise us up out of the muck and the mire that we're in, and that there really is a place in which real fulfillment happens.
Haven't you also found that part of why these writers are prophetic in that sense about what it means to be human is just restoring that sense of transcendence? So that, is it Charles Taylor who talks about the goods of the modern world are production and reproduction? There's just, sort of material prosperity and intimate companionate pair bonding of some sort is about as high as we can reach in terms of modern goods. And just this sense of being made for communion with a transcendent God, being made for heaven. And it just seems to me again and again, the writers were talking about kind of, with this mythopoeic imagination, the sense of the human is a pre-modern sense of the human person is made for a transcendent end. It's a large, capacious, and expansive view of what it means to be human.
So you might say then that this appreciation of transcendence as the background to being human, therefore means that there's a mystery to being human that we never want to penetrate.
Well, I think that the conversation that we've been having is a perfect example of how we are so deeply similar. Because we were all just brought together today. Some of us already know each other, and some of us don't know each other at all. But yet, there's a resonance here. There's a resonance here because we are formed in ways that are not radically distinctive, but actually radically similar. And what we see is that in conversations like this, we are unified around the centrality of these sorts of ideas, this organization of the universe that was made by a loving creator God. So we would just like to take this time and thank you for spending some time with us. Thank all of you for being here, and we hope to do this again someday. Thanks.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.